I remember one time when I was probably about 12 years old that my brother and I went to the opera for the first time with mom and dad. Mom loves the opera, but my dad doesn't. But somehow she managed to convince him to go every once in a while. And I imagine that mom was interested in fostering a love for the classical music and the opera in her children, or at least she thought that we were old enough to appreciate the opera. But I don't remember anything about that night. The only one thing I do remember and is that when the first act finished, and one of the aides came and told us that we were invited to change our seats a few rows in front of us, and that sounded great to me. They actually moved us to a better place. True, it was only a few steps ahead from where we were originally, but I felt like I was in the front row. Everyone likes being in the front row, especially if that implies a benefit or a recognition. We can see this in our society today and in an exaggerated way in social networks where there are people competing to generate views, likes, and followers. But social networks are just a reflection of precisely society. It is a constant competition to obtain what is the best things, to take advantage, to occupy the best positions, to be in the front row. And we're not just satisfied with getting to the front row, but we want everyone to notice it because we want to achieve more prestige or more authority or more recognition. This is not a recent problem, though. In ancient societies, for example, in Judea at the time of Jesus, people competed for the best positions. Cultural anthropologists refer to this system in which Jesus lived with the term honor and shame societies. This means that what governed the behavior of people in those societies was the perception of the rest of the society. What I mean is, if a person did something that society considered good, then that person was perceived as someone worthy of honor and recognition. On the contrary, if that person did something wrong, then society perceived them as worthy of shame and rejection. So people competed for places of honor, and many times that included damaging other people's reputations on purpose for them to be considered worthy of honor and recognition. And there are several ways to win honor in those kinds of societies. For example, doing acts of charity, since obviously that won the favor of the society. Another way was having special attention with people who are already considered honorable, because then those honorable people that received the special attention when were forced to return the favor. Another way, of course, was to observe and keep the laws, because someone who adheres to what society considers correct is obviously well seen. And that's what happened with the Pharisees in Jesus' time. They pretended to do acts of kindness, but in reality, their intention was to gain honor from the community. Similarly, by observing and fulfilling the laws and commandments, the Pharisees acquired good positions of honor in the eyes of society, and then the Pharisees themselves determined who did not comply with the laws and therefore deserved to be despised by society and rejected. On several occasions, though, Jesus was able to see the true intentions of the Pharisees and of all the people who sought their own honor, and Jesus exposed them. This is what happens in the passage that we read from Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. A prominent Pharisee honored Jesus by inviting him to the Sabbath dinner at his house. And the purpose was twofold, but it revolved around the same thing, honor. On the one hand, we read that the Pharisees that were at the same party were observing and watching Jesus, expecting and waiting if he was to break the Sabbath laws. Because if he broke the laws, then the Pharisees would expose Jesus as a lawbreaker and therefore worthy of rejection. And the Pharisees then would be regarded as someone righteous and holy, so they would be considered honorable. But if Jesus did not break the laws of Sabbath, then he would be considered worthy of honor. But now Jesus would have the obligation to honor this prominent Pharisee who had invited him to his home and return the favor. So in any case, this prominent Pharisee wanted to somehow increase his social standing and to be deemed as someone worthy of honor. But Jesus does not follow the norms of any society. And not only does he reject the norms, but also exposes them and challenges them and turns them upside down. So in this passage, we are able to observe a particular custom that the societies based on honor and shame systems used to have. And that was the organization of the food tables by hierarchies. The closer one sat to the host, the more honor that person had. And so Jesus, the gospel tells us, was observing that behavior happening at the meal where he was invited. So he tells them a parable that will turn this thinking on honor upside down. Jesus tells, if you go to a party or to a wedding and sit in the front row thinking that you are a super important guest and you're going to be honored, you run the risk of someone who has more honor, who's more distinguished than you coming. And when that person comes, then you're going to be kicked out of your front row, and in front of everyone's eyes, in full view of the people attending, you're going to be sent from the first to the last row. Better, says Jesus, sit in the back row, in the last row, so that if you are actually the guest of honor, the one who invited you will come for you and make you go to the front row, and everyone will notice how much honor you have. So the lesson seems obvious. If you really want to gain honor and avoid shame, you must keep a low profile. And eventually, the time will come when everyone will see how important you really are. But in reality, Jesus goes beyond the obvious, because the scripture says that Jesus is not giving them advice to shine in society, but actually Jesus is telling them a parable. And parables are illustrations or stories that explain deeper realities about the kingdom of God. What Jesus is really saying is, stop worrying about who has more honor. Stop worrying about sitting in the front row or at least a few steps ahead from your neighbor. So Jesus is actually questioning that system of valuing and categorizing people according to what they do in the eyes of society. And even more, Jesus is questioning this letting the public opinion determine our value and whether we are accepted or not. And we could go a little further. Maybe it's not public opinion, but I'm sure there are other things that make us feel that we are valuable and worthy of honor and recognition. Perhaps we think that our family and the way our family lives and the relation we have determines whether we're good people and therefore to be considered honorable. Maybe we let our job or our career and how far we've come dictate that we deserve recognition. Perhaps it is even our involvement in church that makes us think we're honorable. Perhaps we also actually think that society evaluates us and assigns us places in the first, second, fifth, or last row. But Jesus tells us, stop that, that's enough. Wanting to get to the front row is only going to bring you more shame and sadness and anguish. The search for self-worth is a fruitless and disastrous search. Because the irony is that the value and honor that we intend to seek in human and earthly things or systems, we already have it from the beginning. God formed mankind out of something as vile, as low as the very dust of the earth. But he declared mankind to be in his image and likeness. And even after sin, human beings continue to be the image of God. Little lower than the angels, says Psalm 8, that God made the human being. A little lower than the angels, but you crown him with glory and honor. God put his own glory on the head of every person, woman or man, who's ever lived or will live on earth. God already put us in the front row. And if all people are created in the image of God, then there's no point in competing to see who has more honor, more worth, or glory. And therefore, to belittle other people in order for us to have better positions is to actually belittle the image of God in them. So, where do we find our value? But Jesus goes one step further. He's now addressing this prominent Pharisee who invited him. And he tells them, do you really want to receive honor and recognition? So don't invite people who can return the favor and honor you. Well, that is precisely what the Pharisee wants to do. Give people or do something for people so they can later do something for the Pharisee. And Jesus says it's better to invite people who cannot repay you, giving you more honor. You have actually to invite the people you yourself have determined deserve the shame and reaction of society. Because Jesus is actually talking or telling the Pharisee to invite those that are considered non-worthy in the society. So Jesus has already dismantled the systems we use to determine our own worth, but now he's calling us to dignify and to uphold the value of other people, particularly those who suffer rejection and marginalization. It is no longer even a question of finding our own value, but of restoring the value of the people who have been robbed it. It is about leaving our seat in the front row, going to the last row, and saying to the rejected ones, my friend, go to a better place. It is about giving those people your seat in the front row, and you going back to stay in the last row. If you're going to have a dinner, a luncheon, or a banquet, says Jesus, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then you will be blessed, for although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So it's not just about feeding the poor and tending the sick, although that is certainly included. Rather, Jesus calls us to honor and dignify the people who do not have honor to pay us back, because they do not have honor for themselves. In the context of his time, Jesus is saying that all the points of honor in society must be used to honor the despised, the rejected. Because, of course, the honor and shame systems are zero-sum games, where the honor that I have is honor that you don't have, where the more honor that I have, the more dishonor you have. So if the prominent Pharisee invites these rejected people to his banquets, he is actually giving them his own points of honor. And since they cannot repay him, then the Pharisee loses honor and prestige until he ends himself up in the last row. Jesus is actually calling us to altruism, to carry out those acts that cost me and that completely benefit the other person without them having to pay anything. And altruism can be shown in different forms. Economic support that is not expected to be repaid, doing favors for people without hoping they will return the favor, giving time generously, and forgiving without expecting other people to ask for forgiveness, or even asking forgiveness without expecting to be forgiven. It is to love without conditions. As Jesus said, is doing acts of love, making acts of love with the right hand without the left hand knowing. To paraphrase the great theologian Richard Foster, there is nothing that disciplines self-centeredness like service to others. And there's nothing that transforms self-centeredness like service that goes unnoticed. We will know that we have really abandoned the exhausting and disastrous search for self-worth when we are able to serve others without anyone noticing and without expecting even a thank you. So first, Jesus called us to stop looking for our own value as persons in the things of earth and to find our value and honor in the simple fact of being human beings created in the image of God. And then Jesus calls us to see the same value and honor in all other people because they were also made in the image of God, and therefore I should not despise them in order to exalt myself. But now it is also about dignifying and honoring people who themselves or others have made them forget that they are also the worthy image of God. And notice how Jesus ends his teaching. And you will be blessed, for although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And notice that certainly Jesus is speaking of a reward, of being repaid. But he says that it will happen in the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus is inviting this prominent Pharisee and you and me today not to seek to be worthy of honor, but to seek to be righteous. In other words, it is not about what I should do to be considered important by other people, but it is about how I can do the will of God in love and justice and righteousness towards my neighbor. Philippians 2, the so-called Carmen Christi, tells us that Jesus had all the glory and honor. He was sitting front row in heaven, but he did not cling to being considered worthy of honor, but stripped himself of all his privileges and went all the way back to the last row to give everything he had, his glory, his honor, and his very life out of unconditional love for you and me. Will we do the same?